gets it. Do you remember what Paul was before? He was a socially acceptable murderer, is what he was. Hitman. He imprisoned people. He murdered Christians, people who were following Christ. And all of a sudden, there's this transformational experience that Paul has. Paul's not some story, by the way. Paul's like a real dude. He existed. You know what I mean? He wrote a lot of books, and that we look back to today, and they tell us a lot about who Jesus is, right? Now, why did he write all those books? Why was it so transformational for him? Because he had an encounter with Jesus. And he had an encounter with the real love of Jesus. And when that encounter comes, all of a sudden, it changes everything. I mean, you are not the same. You know, Lexi was just sharing, she's like, I grew up going to church. I did too. I went to church every Sunday. My parents were very faithful. We were very faithful to our church. But it wasn't until college. Actually, it started before that. God started working in me before this. But I remember a specific day in college when I had an encounter with God. And you could have been in that room with me, and you would have been like, what is Kevin doing? What is going on? But inside of me, something shifted in this huge way. I mean, I was down on my knees, and I was bawling. I was sobbing. And I was like, what is going on with me? And it was that God had gotten a hold of my heart. And he shifted something deep inside of me. And I've never been the same since. Now, there are times where I start to drift. And I start to forget. And what I forget really is that love of Christ. That's what I forget. But every time I come back to that, it's like, yeah. More of this. More of this. This is good. This is good. For Paul, it compelled him. It changed his life destiny. He started traveling all over the Mediterranean, in places where Jesus himself hadn't gone, right? Jesus was to the tribes of Israel, but now, Paul is taking this message and he's going to Greece and Macedonia and all these different places. And that sounds great. I love to travel. It's send me to Turkey and Greece and all these kind of places. I love that. But no. It wasn't like that for him. We're talking shipwrecks. We're talking getting bitten by a viper, probably getting sick, all because he wanted to tell the message to anyone who would listen. He wanted people to know because Christ's love was so transformational in him that he wanted everybody to know. So he raised up leaders to share the message and others to go and tell about who Jesus was and what he had done. Then he says something interesting after talking about this compelling love of Christ that compelled him. He says this in 2 Corinthians 5:16. So from now on, we regard no one from a worldly point of view. Though we once regarded Christ in this way, we do so no longer. All of us have probably had this moment where we viewed Christ in a certain way. There are many people that know about Jesus. There are people that call out his name all the time. They don't know him. But they have some sort of impression about him. Probably the impression is the wrong impression, is my guess. And the shift comes when we see Jesus as he is. Or at least when we get a glimpse of who he truly is. But then Paul says this. Now it changed how I view other people. Not just as this love compelled me, but I see you differently because of how I see Jesus. Okay? All right, I saw Aquaman. Good movie. We had to go the night it came out, And I want to tell you about this scene, and hopefully I can describe it well, but Aquaman and Princess Mira, okay? They have to go in search of something. And so they have this clue, right? It's like this poem that's written out, and they're trying to figure out what all the clues mean in this poem. It was in a bottle, okay? And they had to go up on this hill, and they're trying to figure out, they're surrounded by these like Italian statues. It's this town in Sicily, okay? They're surrounded by these statues, and they're like, okay, what does this mean? And all of a sudden he realizes, wait a minute, the clue is actually inside the bottle. Not just the written clue, but like, so he lifts up the bottle and he looks into it, and etched at the bottom of the bottle, he sees like kind of like a map kind of thing, okay? And he's like, oh, okay, we've got something here. But then they continue to read the clue because they still don't know what to do with it. And it says, only the king can view this bottle correctly. All right? Only the king can give the location. And so they're like, what does this mean? Well, they look and they're surrounded by these statues, and they realize, hey, wait a minute. One of these statues must be a king. So they're looking, and he's like, oh, I know this. This is like, this Greek king or whatever. And finally, the statue has this upheld hand, and he puts the bottle in the hand. And they have to walk behind the statue, and they have to look through the eyes of the king, through the bottle. And guess what? They see what they're looking for, right? And I started thinking about this picture, and I'm like, what a beautiful picture this is. Don't you love it when you get spiritual things from movies? Yeah. It's pretty awesome, huh? Okay, so I'm like thinking about this, and I'm like, that's it. When we place ourselves behind the King, when we realize how much love he has, when we begin to look at things through his eyes, we see everything from a totally different perspective. We get it. Things come into view that were out of focus before because we're seeing through the eyes of the one who knows. And we're seeing through eyes of love when we look through his eyes. It changes our perspective. And that's what happens when we look through the eyes of the King. It's easier said than done, though, right? Because we have to humble ourselves to look through somebody else's eyes. It means we have to kind of put ourselves on a little bit lower platform than maybe we might see ourselves at times. And your lifetime and mine will be spent learning to receive this grace-filled love from Jesus that he's always wanting to give, though, right? And even more so to give that grace-filled love to other people. So it's one thing for us to receive. It's an entirely other thing for us to be able to give that love, right? Paul said, and compassion. Paul said we have to consider others who are not like us as being more important to us. More important than us. That's in that Philippians 2 chapter. I always have a little trouble with that one. All right? Like, what? I have to consider everybody more important than me? Okay, I mean, in my mind, that's what I do. I want to do. But really, in reality, I struggle with that. That's tough. Sometimes we have to learn to restrain our tongues from unleashing words of anger. And we have to instead become instruments of wholeness and healing, right? And it's not easy. Have you ever watched a hummingbird? Yeah. Hummingbirds are like truly grace in motion. And I remember I was like, one time I was in Colorado. I was at the Royal Gorge. Beautiful place. It's kind of like a miniature Grand Canyon, But I wasn't as fascinated by the canyon anymore when I walked into their garden. And they had this garden that had like bird feeders and like flowers everywhere. And I sat down just waiting on some other people. And all of a sudden I saw this like... and I'm like, what was that? Because I heard the sound first, right? Like you hear the sound of like the wind moving somehow. And then all of a sudden your eyes kind of focus and you're like, whoa, that was a hummingbird. And they're like so fast, but they're like so smooth. And then they like stop somewhere and they just hover, right? But it looks like they're perfectly still. It looks like they're perfectly still. Does anybody have hummingbird feeders?
Yeah.
Yeah?
I lived in Mississippi. There's hummingbirds.
A lot of hummingbirds in Mississippi?
Yeah.
Okay, very cool. I love it. You know what hummingbirds do? They hover and they draw the sweetness out of things. They draw sweetness. Now, what we don't see is how fast those wings are beating.
Yeah.
How hard they have to work. They're like a small little machine that's just going, and They can flap their wings up to 80 times per second. Per second. Can you imagine that? Like, that's a lot of hard work. And you know what? I think there's sort of a metaphor here. Because we have to learn to be these people that extend grace, right? And sometimes, to be a gracious person on the outside, it takes a lot of flapping of those wings. It takes a lot of little movements and a lot of practice to have that grace-filled kind of love that, draws the sweetness out of things that are difficult to draw the sweetness out of. Especially other people sometimes, right?
Yeah.
So think like a hummingbird, That's grace in motion, and that's what I seek for. So here's my 3-point sermon for you. All right? The first thing is, point number 1, love.
Amen.
That's it. That's a good point, isn't it? Why? Because Christ first loved us. Because his love compels us. Because he humbled himself to bring love in the most powerful way for you. Okay? That's point number 1. Point number 2, love some more. All right? Love some more. So in this passage, Philippians 2, we read this. It said, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love. Same love. Okay. Being one in spirit and one in mind. Okay, think of these 3 things as one thought. They're one thought that he's giving. Okay? And he says like-minded. And like-minded in this case means having the same love. Okay? It doesn't mean that we all think the same thoughts, because we don't, right? We all have different perspectives. That's impossible. And actually groupthink, where everybody's like, yes, man, and yeah, we're all going to say the same thing. It's not healthy. It's not natural, actually. So I'm glad that we all have a diversity of thought in this place. But let's have the same love. And so in this case, like-minded means that we have the same goal here. It means that we're trying to accomplish the same purpose, okay? And that goal is receiving love and giving love in Jesus' name. That's what Paul is saying right here. That's what it means by having the same love, okay? So differences and disagreements within the church, that never happens, right? It's sad, though. I hear of churches that, they divide over, what seems to me like the stupidest things.
Yeah.
I'm like, are you crazy? We have differences and disagreements within the church over giving, over what songs to sing, over how to do communion, or how loud the sound should be, or who should do what. But those things can be softened when we decide that our priority is to be one in spirit first. And as we choose to love and be loved instead. That has to drive our motives within the church, within the body of Christ. Amen. It has to. That's the only way that this thing can work and function, right? And then between Christians, okay? Our unity is strong when we work toward being one in spirit with others who love Jesus. Bottom line, who love Jesus, but who may worship very differently in their gatherings. And we have to let go of the I'm right about this doctrine and I'm right about this doctrine. Unless it's the major ones, right? But ultimately the bottom line is this, does this person really love Jesus?
Yeah.
Is their heart his? Then you know what? I'm with them. You know what? My goal and my purpose for living is the same as theirs.
Amen.
So let's do this thing together. There's a power in that. In fact, this verse that Colleen read, love one another just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. I like how he repeats himself in that. It's like, you need to get this. By this, everyone will